Okay, thank you. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Xiao Jian from the School of Literature, Zhejiang University, and my major is Chinese Studies and Literature. And as you see, it's 4 a.m. in China now, so uh, it's very late for me. And thank you for all of you today for inviting me to attend this meeting and allow me to share some of my personal researches on the archive and some of the on the archive of the Chinese fan. As just as the title said, I want to discuss about the science fiction fans in Chinese universities and college. And sorry. So here is the structure of the presentation today. So I will start with a brief introduction of the science fiction fandom in Chinese universities and college. And then I would like to discuss about the archives in Federation. In this title, I would like to prove the necessity for a science fiction fandom in Chinese universities and college to preserve and reserve these archives and how to use these archives to uh, help them to complete in and gain their necessity and in their spaces, materials, and schedules in a competitive mechanism developed by the administrations of the universities and the college. And we will discuss about the memory. Using this title, I would like to discuss how archives of the fandom help the fans in Chinese universities and the college to help them to develop their definition in fandom and also help them to gain recognition from the outside field. So before or at the beginning of today's presentation, I would like to cite these words from the editors from the science fiction world. And as we all know, science fiction world is one of the biggest SF magazines in China now. It He told us that we decided to provide support for the preservation of the archival materials of the college and the university science fiction societies, such as scanning, storage, and hard disk equipment. So he said this at annual meeting held by the science fiction world for the science fiction societies in Chinese university and the college just a few days ago. Actually, the magazine held this meeting to help the societies, different societies in different universities, to know each other and to discuss how to help these societies and associations to grow up. And during this meeting, the students discuss about their difficulty in preserving their materials and archives. And you see that some students mentioned that they have a lot of archives to preserve, but we don't have spaces, or we try to use the internet, but we don't have enough equipment like hard disks. And the science fiction world told them that the magazine will and they were willing to help. So you should notice that actually the science fiction societies in Chinese universities and the college has become a huge amount and a huge population, and it has gained enough recognition from the outside world, especially in the science fiction industry in China. So how do we describe the situation of the science fiction society in China? I will try to use some statistics. This is a brief introduction of the science fiction fandom in Chinese universities and college. We could notice that actually, according to nowadays academic researches and some of the reports written by the fans themselves, the first science fiction clubs in Chinese universities should be considered as the science fiction club in Shanghai International Studies University in 1991. But actually, this club was set up by some scholars and professors in the foreign language department who are learning science fiction and translate who were learning science fiction and translating science fiction from the Western world. At the time, some of the Western writers were introduced to China during the reform and opening up, and these professors and the teachers and the especially the young scholars, are the first people to get connection with the writers, and they try to form some of the groups to discuss and help them to translate and introduce this science fiction. But we should notice that actually, I think these clubs should be considered as an academic group or academic community, just like the science fiction center held by Undergraduate University in 1989. So when it came to the science fiction societies created by the science fiction fans themselves, we could notice that the first one that was set up in 1993 in Sichuan University. So why was the Sichuan University? The reason, I think, is the science fiction world, as we all know, is one of the biggest one. And actually, at that time, it's the only science fiction magazine in China. It was set up by so and the science fiction world is in Chengdu, and it was set. So students in Chengdu universities can get access to the science fiction magazines, get access to the editors, writers, and the fandom very easily. And they could seize the chance and the opportunity to set up a science fiction class. And now I think there are about 100 science fiction clubs in 3,000 Chinese universities and colleges. And we should notice that actually it's very equivalent. Most of the clubs are set up in the top universities in China, and the members. Most of the members of the science fiction clubs are undergraduate students, and there are some undergraduate students. But I think the undergraduate students are the most part of the members. But you should notice that the quantitation or the population of the members is very different. Some of the clubs can only have amount of like 40 or 50 people. But some of them, as I don't know, like the science fiction clubs in Sichuan University could hold a huge amount of people. They have over 1,000 members. So you should notice that science fiction clubs in Chinese universities have grown a lot during these years, and it has become the main power of the Chinese science fiction fandom. And if we want to discuss about some organizations or clubs of the Chinese sci-fi fans, you should notice that actually most of them are the clubs set up in Chinese universities and colleges. So by this discussion and the introduction of the situation of the science fiction fandom in Chinese universities and college, we should notice that it's very important for us to understand the situation of the fandom in universities and college, considering that they are actually the most part of the fandom. So we know that most of the science fiction fandom, or the club, or the societies in Chinese universities would hold some activities like lectures and ceremonies, in which they will invite some editors or writers, to 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 attend as the guest of honor, or they can play games, with the members, like video games, like board games, or others. Also, most of them are facing many problems and the dilemma, and the various problems and the dilemma. I think we can notice them, during our research on them. So let me introduce introduction of a very simple structure of the science fiction clubs in a Chinese university or club. You should know that first, the science fiction club was led by the president. He or she will lead different departments. Different departments work on different things like finance, like writing novels, writing science fiction, writing fun magazine. And you also need a department to help the president to deal with some administrative services. Most of them are originated by the instructors. Usually the instructor is a professor from the department of your university. Most of the department are like the physics, literature, or something like that. And you should notice that the guidance center for the student clubs of the university are also at the top of the structure of this leadership structure. The guidance center and the administration of the department are responsible for the action and activities of society and the club, and they will keep track of the activities of the club. So, stereotypically, if a sci-fi club wants to change its leader for the activities and post to the students in the university, or publish its own fan magazine, the science fiction club should be authorized by the instructors and the administration, and they also need the permission from the student center. And from this structure, we should notice that the science fiction club is not a single club leader owned or lead by the students themselves. Actually, the department and the administration of the university could also take part in it, and most of the time they could keep part of it and ask the society to obey the rules set up by the university. And you can see some of the regulations like that. Like these regulations is the regulation which called the measures for the management of the construction of students' associations in college and universities. It was first published in 2020 by the National Education Administration as a nationwide regulations for the universities and the college to help them to instruct the activities of the clubs and the associations owned by the students in college and the university. You can see that actually these measures are very various, and if you read the full passage, you will notice that actually it's has instructed all fields of a club, from how to set a club, how to run a club, how to set up an activity held by the club, how to ask the department and the administration in universities and college to keep track of and being getting control of the clubs and help them to obey the rules, obey the law, and also how the president was elected by the members in the club and the holders, and how to use sponsorship and the finance, and how to organize the financial statistics of students association. And these regulations has formed a huge, I think, a huge vibe of instruction to the students association to help the students association follow the track developed by the administration and the whole society to keep the track of the main culture and follow the purpose set up by the educational administration. But you should understand that lots of the preservation of the archives are established for the memory, for the evidence of the activities, for the demands from the administration. And we should notice that the structure of the leadership in a students' club. We should notice that it's a three-class structure from the guidance center and the department of administration, and also the university and the instructors and the president. And these leadership web form very significant regulations and competitive measures for the students' club in Chinese university. You can notice that the first purpose of the clubs was set up to fill the demands of regulations and the administration. And the regulation was set up to help us to as the measures set up by the administration department set up was an important carrier for the implementation of the fundamental task of cultivating moral integrity and promoting quality education. So you should notice that in the expectation of the administration department and also actually the main culture, a student club shouldn't be set up just for fun. It should be set up to help to promote educational tasks in university, to help students build up their abilities. So we can notice that there are the necessity for regulations, for the competitive measures set up by the university to help the student body to follow the right track, the proper track of development, and use the competitive measures like the competition for funding and the support funds. We have noticed that according to the measures, the university should set up some funding to help the student clubs run. But actually, most of the universities set up some different competitive measures on the systems for student clubs to compete with each other. You need to illustrate why the activities held by your own club should be funded by the funding of the school, and you need to you need other competition, fight for some honorary motivation or different owners for the club or for the president or the leaders in the club themselves. Most of the competition are based on quantitative statistics, and the statistics were gathered by the administration department using the materials, using the statistics of the clubs. You can notice that the administration can use the materials and collect the materials by themselves by like the interviewing, like tracking, or gathering the records of the activities. But also they want the clubs to handle some materials to illustrate and prove that they have different activities and to illustrate that how meaningful their activity is. So this is the first purpose for a student club or a sci-fi club to preserve and produce their historical archives. They need to use these archives to fill the demands of the regulation from the administration, and to help them to win the competence of the state ownership or owners and other limited resources in Chinese university. Which is very
to interrupt. You're at time, so please wrap up your presentation.
So, okay. So, I'm going to start for that. And it's a website for the student club administration of my home university. You can see actually most of the notice are composed of the competitive and gathering material. So you could notice that the students club need to have to face the different competence, and they need to win these competence for schedule, for space, and for sponsorship. And so this student club has different typical forms of archives. You can see like the books, magazine collections, or this posters produced, or posters, administrative materials produced by the society themselves. We can also use archives to serve for the society. And you can notice that besides filling the demands of the administration departments, the materials and the archives can help the society to build up their memories, like the space. They use the spaces for collections, use the internet materials, gain support, and also they can gain support from the instruction, from the other university administration, or from some social institution like SSW. So, and help them to build up their self-recognition in the process of produce archives and read and recognition and share these materials with each other. And also during reproduction procedure, they can use these materials to help them to build their own recognition of a way of life. We know, as we all know, that science fiction is a way of life or being meaningful. And you could notice that at the end of my personal presentation, I would like to introduce Riverflow and his work on the Zero Gravity magazine, which is also the winner of the Hugo Award for Best Magazine in 2023. And actually, he did a lot of job in preserving and researching on the archives in Chinese science fiction universities.
Awesome. Thank you for your presentation. Next, we have Shanti Patchett. Shanti is a fourth-year undergraduate student from UCLA. She studies psychology and recently completed an assistantship at the Computational Social Neuroscience Lab. Past presentations include classics research entitled Athenian Male Socio-Sexual Relationships and the fashion gallery show Re-Enlist, Out of Regs Refurbishing of Military Uniforms. Shanti was the 34th annual MLK Oratorical winner for her spoken word piece, Body. and her poem Beatrice is published in the Stanford Shazura. Currently, Shanti is obtaining a minor in creative writing. She works as an editorial associate at an LA-based publishing agency and hopes to pursue graduate education in the future.
Can you guys hear me from this? Yay. Okay, excellent. Copy that. Okay. Excellent. Okay. Hello. My name is Shanti Hatchett, and I'm a fourth-year undergraduate studying psychology and creative writing at UCLA. Today, I would like to showcase to you all my research and conclusions I've come to as I've completed my creative inquiry for Beatrice. The QR code below is a link to the talk for those who'd like to follow along for their own devices. 2 years ago, a woman named Beatrice started to make a space for herself in my mind. She was witty, she was sad, she was queer, she was Black, and she lived in only a moment. An idyllic, knife-edge moment that she got to stay in, but for the magic of being imagined. A year after that came Stheno, the less famous sister of Medusa, a woman who, while not mythologized, witnessed tragedy she is doomed to survive over and over. A monster without a myth. I decided they should meet. But this decision necessitated my first great sacrifice. I would need to take Beatrice out of that frozen moment in my mind. To do so, I rolled around the feeling of that moment, tried to find a real component for it in my mind that spoke truth to me and it. I found that it felt like the top of an arc, the elation of a leap paying off even as you prepare for the fall, the feeling of placing gravity back on your shoulders before you've gotten your fill of flying, of conjuring the taste of blood and the ringing of ears even before acquaintance with the ground. In short, the feel of falling with the joy of height. I decided to be the Reconstruction era. Let's see if I can make a slide here. Exciting. 1873. Beatrice settled into the setting easily. She would be a blind heiress in need of company. She'd purchase an ancient Greek statue at auction, take it home, and a year from then, she dreamed the Gorgon statue she brought would break free. Beatrice would wake to a loud bang and head to her study, find a woman where only a statue used to be. The story ate at me, so I started researching. I began with what I knew least, Medusa and her tragedy. The aspects of her that intrigued me in the beginning were her often conflicting mythologies. Her as a hideous monster, her as a great beauty, her as a possessor of the body, while also being possessed. I could go for ages, especially regarding the aspects of her mythology concerning assault of Poseidon and her transformation by Athena. What intrigued me in my research were the consistencies. There is a consensus that Medusa was mortal, while her two Gorgon sisters were not. Not only that, but in this specific Hesiod quote, I'd like to draw attention to the fact that he states her fate was a sad one, almost because of this fact. Another consistency was her origin. Across primary sources, Medusa is tightly tied to an African origin. In some myths, Libya is where she makes her home, and others she's an Ethiopian queen, but always she is killed in her sleep by the banks of the river with her sisters beside her. Always her head is taken, the third raptus or rape of Medusa, to Europe. It is what happens then that solidifies the meaning for me. She is appropriated. Her hairstyle is mimicked by Roman elite women, her curls, her head is used to decorate the aegis of an already appropriated garb. The only consistent thing about Medusa is her proximity to Blackness. I'll posit, however, that her inconsistencies are Black as well. The narrative surrounding Blackness pushed forward by supremacist institutions must inhabit dissonance. How else can supremacists preach superiority over Black folks while acting as though those same Black folks are dangerous threats to a way of life? It is why Black women are stereotyped as masculine and exotic, disgusting and lustful. It is how rape becomes tryst, power becomes subordination. It is how humans, through generalized paradox, become nothing. Finally, it is how Medusa is Black. She has no domain. She has no foretold fate. She exists only in her violence, in her tragedy. Except there is Steno, Medusa's older sister, present every time Medusa's body was not her own, while remembering a time when it was. My mind reaches to Steno, left with her sister's body on the beach, ageless. I'm compelled to wonder, is Steno laments her sister mythology? I'm compelled to believe that sisterhood defeats paradox. I kept the sisterhood in mind as I entered W.E.B. Du Bois's The Black Reconstruction, a source I chose to rely on a leading source. One section in particular intrigued me, the white worker. In this chapter, Du Bois outlines how mass European immigration in the latter half of the 1800s brought Marxism to the forefront of political debate alongside abolitionism. While many European immigrants entered the United States as abolitionists, many abandoned these ideals in favor of the labor free soil movement. As noted in the above quote, Du Bois noted a hostility between white Marxists and abolitionists. While both parties wanted labor reform, one side believed the freedom of the other would directly hinder their progressive movement. Where Steno's dreamed loyalty broke paradox, the reality of betrayal between brother workers perpetuated it. In the end, slavery ended there was Reconstruction, but there was also Jim Crow. Capitalism as a force of labor subjugation managed to seduce white Marxist workers fleeing the feudal systems of Europe into perpetuating feudal slavery in the form of sharecropping. The question is, how did the seduction happen? The answer is paradox. To call oneself progressive while stepping on the neck of a fellow worker is dissonant. To call an enslaved person a job threat once freed, while also implying that chattel slavery is necessary to give direction to Black folks, is dissonant. Let's encapsulate all that dissonance of the progressive white worker into a seed. That seed was planted in the foundations of the Reconstruction. As the Reconstruction grew with pure and democratic effort from the formerly enslaved, so did that seed. Eventually, it ruptured the foundation. The backslide into segregationist oppression is proof of that. I'll push further that this rupture is a cyclic paradox. Reconstruction, regression, Reconstruction, regression. There's a Reconstruction and there is Jim Crow. There is a civil rights movement. There's a war on drugs. There's a Black president for all his faults. And there is this. I realized as I researched that I needed something. I needed Beatrice to show me how to fall. I needed Steno to talk about who Medusa was as a sister. I don't know how many of us are taught to insulate or counter-define ourselves, to move purposefully but quietly, to do all the little things that get us through the backswing. I wanted Beatrice to teach me the interplay of race, queerness, and disability with class. I needed Steno to grieve and wonder what kind of God is worth one being. I needed them to show me, and then I wanted to write it. But was I right to want that? Do I have a responsibility to historical accuracy, to realism? And if I do, how can I possibly represent the perspective of a blind, queer Black woman during the Reconstruction without a single representative primary source? In the article, Venus in Two Acts by Dr. Saida Hartman, she struggles with the same questions. In the piece, she fights to reconcile the truth of two enslaved girls' murders according to an archival court record with her own urge to write a, quote, romance. She imagines them as friends, holding each other in comfort before their separation and death, despite the archive having no support for this version of events. But how could it? She notes that the archive of the enslaved is inundated with scandal and excess. In short, for the two young girls to exist as per the archive, they must be products of violence. In the end, Hartman writes her romance, but notes that any research looking to fill gaps in the archive must be at peace with failing to give voice to the unrepresented. I am more than at peace with this kind of failure. Quote, those existences relegated to the non-historical or deemed wasted exercise a claim on the present and demand us to imagine a future in which the afterlife of slavery is ended. The necessity of trying to represent what we cannot, rather than leading to pessimism or despair, must be embraced as the impossibility that conditions our knowledge of the past and animates our desire for a liberated future. In the quote above, Hartman demonstrates to me the power of Afrofuturist speculative fiction, even when it travels backwards. The power of creative inquiry in this genre is not to fill the archive. It is to educate some on what was and give credence to what is. Liberal sabotage did not die. The paradox of Blackness is ever present. And Medusa continues to be a battleground of symbology. Creative inquiry offers another hand, though. While lets an audience know an enemy, it also lets them imagine how predecessors persisted. It lets them imagine the end of paradox and half-life, the steps to freedom as they have been walked over and over again. Medusa's head was described by scholars Marjorie Garber and Nancy J. Vickers as, quote, apoptropaic, literally warding off or turning away the evil it embodies. With that, I will leave you with the beginning of Beatrice's story, a short vignette called White Lady. Oh, a fun little tidbit. We're skipping it. The White Lady by Shaunti Hatchett. My Grammy tells me stories on long, hot afternoons when Daddy won't be home for a while. With our feet in the creek, I look deep into the forest, snuggling close to her soft side whenever a bit of fear runs through me. I ask, what's out there? She laughs, trees, and I say, no, really. She tells me, well, there is the White Lady. And I ask to hear more is the White Lady wanders the woods at night with a white cotton dress and a pale face that glows. She's always crying, head in hands, and if she sees you, she'll climb down your throat, become the chill down your spine. She'll leave you empty, wondering what you ever were or could have been, and ask at the end, Grammy, why is she so mean? She says, oh, honey child, she's looking for her baby. Then she rises on her stick and asks me to lead her from the creek. Our feet dry in the ryegrass, sun tea is served on the porch, and then Daddy comes up the path. I never told my Grammy that I had seen the White Lady. I'd woken in the middle of the night. My door was cracked. I'd risen, looked into the hall, and saw her, white dress, pale skin. I followed her to my daddy's study. She wasn't crying, just seemed mad. She entered his room, and I looked through the door crack. Charles, I absolutely cannot. Baby, please. Daddy's voice pleading. I've looked in on her, and she's so damn dark I couldn't see her in the bed. A confused hurt fluttered in my head, round and round. I couldn't understand. She looks like me. I don't know what you were expecting. Well, when I birthed her, she passed. What are you doing? Leave her outside all day to spy at me? I absolutely cannot. Please just talk to her. She needs her mommy. A pause. Then a shaky voice. Charlie, baby. A rustle of clothes. I don't mean to be cruel. I love you. I love Beatrice, but you're both fine without me. How long before questions get asked? If people find out, they'd hurt you bad. I know. And my father sounds sad. I know what I did. Am I a what now? His eyes go wide, steady, like a cricket you lift your cupped hand off of and doesn't know to immediately jump. I'm starting to think you always were. I can feel her in me. Hollowness like a dead tree, the ringing, the wondering of what to be. I feel myself splitting and morphing. I look down at my hand, the difference between the palm and the back. The door opens and there she stands. I look her in the eye, don't move from her path. She's crying. White Lady, I say, and she flinches away. I reach out a hand, wanting to touch something so pretty. She moves around me, down the hall, doors slam, and I never see her again. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. And next is Kara. Kara Reber is a fourth-year undergraduate student at University of California, Los Angeles, studying American literature and gender studies. Kara hopes to pursue a PhD in English literature after she graduates in the fall.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming.
Sorry.
Oh, okay, gotcha. We're going to have to log in.
From here.
Yeah, I do.
Oh, this refresh. It should be in the drive. Are you sure it's an undergraduate college? Oh, it should be under. Oh my god, I hate this now. So it's not an undergraduate college. Yeah, it's not showing there. Yeah, so there should be. Yeah, could you try moving it to undergraduate scholarship? Yeah, I don't know. We might have to try signing in again or opening this again in a different form. Yeah, it's still not showing. Yeah. But I'm going to try, but it is saying Canvas. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm not sure why it's doing that. Yeah, so the only other thing we could do is you could try to log into your own Google account in an incognito tab. Okay.
Yeah, I think it's totally. Like my paper.
Okay. Um, okay. What should we have on the screen then? Okay. Okay. Oh, yeah. Oh, now it's there. Thank you.
And
Yeah. Let's try it now. Yeah. You were saying, yeah, it's not. Yeah, I was.
Yeah, I can do verbally. Okay, perfect.
Okay. Boy.
Alrighty, hi everyone. Thank you for bearing with us.
Okay.
The criteria for what kinds of works should be included within the genre of speculative fiction have been in flux since the genre's origin in the early 1940s. Although there are many definitions and criteria for the genre, the foundational criteria is that the work should be fictional. Due to the fact that archival material is traditionally thought of as real, archival material is often not considered when defining which works are speculative fiction. However, recent scholarship has shown that archives actively erase the lives and stories of minoritarian subjects and therefore change the way that history is narrated. Emergence of this scholarship illustrates the fact that history is a story, one that is actively being reshaped and reconfigured. Sadiya Hartman coins the term critical fabulation to describe the way she approaches archival research. Critical fabulation is a methodology that Hartman uses in her research of the Atlantic slave trade in order to speculate about the lives of enslaved people. Critical fabulation uses a combination of archival research, historical research, and fictional narrative in order to recover what has been omitted from the archive. This paper argues that critical fabulation should be considered a form of speculative fiction because of the way that it is focused on building new worlds within the archive and imagining new possibilities within existing histories, despite the fact that its subjects were real people. Hartman argues that by taking the time to imagine the worlds of minoritarian subjects, we are able to create new futures. This paper will assess Hartman's work, wayward lives, beautiful experiments, intimate histories of riotous Black girls, troublesome women, and queer radicals, in order to demonstrate why critical fabulation and historical narration can be worked into likes of speculative fiction. Arguing that critical fabulation should be considered a speculative fiction does not diminish the practice's material power, but instead highlights the unique ability that speculative fiction works have to shape the present and future through the reimagining of history. The term speculative fiction as a genreic classification first appeared in American media in the 1940s. Robert Heinlein, who was a science fiction author most famous for his novel Star Troopers, is often given credit for the popularization of the term in his essay on the writing of speculative fiction. In this essay, he argues that speculative fiction is distinct from science fiction because it places interest on the value of the human interest story, as well as the gadget story. Since then, the genreic classification has exploded in popularity and has come to mean many different things to many different people. In the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Literature, Marieke Ozaiwicz says, the term speculative fiction has three historically located meanings: a subgenre of science fiction that deals with the human rather than the technological problems, a genre distinct from and opposite to science fiction and its exclusive focus on possible futures, and a supercategory for all genres that deliberately depart from imitating consensus reality of everyday experience. Ozaiwicz goes on to point out the last meaning of speculative fiction allows the genre to encompass a wide range of texts, including fantasy, science fiction, horror, and their subgenres, dystopian fiction, magical realism, fractured fairy tales, etc. Despite speculative fiction's broad criteria, a common denominator seems to be the imagination of future worlds that are different from our own. R.B. Gill makes a similar case in his article, The Uses of Genre and the Classification of Speculative Fiction, published in Mosaic, a journal for interdisciplinary study of literature. Gill writes, speculative fiction, then, is not defined by contrast with literary realism, if by that term we mean an aspect of the author's treatment of material, faithful, objective, independent of the observer, low, or squalid. It will be more useful to define it by contrast with the operational rules of normal society. Gill's definition of speculative fiction, allows for the consideration that an author's imaginative worlds can be just as objective or real as reality. Gill's interrogation of the real versus the fictitious allows us to consider the truth behind imagined worlds. Ozaiwicz also questions the meaning of reality in her definition of speculative fiction. Ozaiwicz says, the fuzzy set field understanding of speculative fiction arose in response to the need for a blanket term for a broad range of narrative forms that subvert the post-Enlightenment mindset, one that had long excluded from literature stories that depart from consensus reality or embraced a different version of reality than the empirical materialist one. Situated against the claims of this paradigm, speculative fiction emerges as a tool to dismantle the traditional Western cultural bias in favor of literature imitating reality, and is a quest for the recovery of a sense of awe and wonder. Ozaiwicz claimed that speculative fiction began as a way to refute post-Enlightenment's logics that value rationality, empiricism, and reason above all else. This understanding of speculative fiction gives the genre a political edge and gives speculative fiction texts the ability to uproot Western epistemologies that prioritize reason and rationality. Ozaiwicz presents imagination and the creation of new worlds in speculative fiction as an act of recovery. Within the context of my argument, the understanding of speculative fiction as recovery of alternate modes of knowledge production, i.e. imagination, illustrates the liberatory potential of speculative fiction. This claim also resonates with archival practices that work to imagine new worlds within existing archival materials that erase the lives of people of color, women, queer people, disabled people, etc., and therefore recovering new modes of knowledge production. While speculative fiction does not have many hard and fast rules for inclusion, there seems to be a universal understanding, or maybe assumption, that speculative fiction must be an imagination of a future world, until recently. Scholars have begun to question the interconnectedness between history and speculative fiction. I would like to expand this relationship by arguing that historical narration and speculative fiction are deeply intertwined. I believe that historical narration and speculative fiction can have a symbiotic relationship, each enhancing the other. John Hennessy edited a book titled History and Speculative Fiction, which was published in 2024. Hennessy describes why speculative fiction and history are conceptualized as separate entities. Hennessy begins with the scientific turn in historical study in the 19th century that established sharp boundaries between history and fiction of all forms. Hennessy points out that though historical scholarship often uses creative elements in order to convey their research, and more importantly, that history is hardly objective. Vice versa, fictional authors don't regard their imagined worlds as false, nor do they believe that readers will understand their fictional constructions as deceptive. Again, we see the blurred lines between truth and fiction and how this opaque relationship can help us understand the interconnectedness of history and speculative fiction. Hennessy attributes the similarities of speculative fiction and history to their ability to help audiences understand the mechanisms of society that we usually consider inherent or natural, and help us to imagine ways that our present world can be different by familiarizing ourselves with other forms of social organization, whether in the factual past or the fictional future. Critical archive study scholarship has brought attention to the fact that historical record is often subject to fallacies and misrepresentations, largely based on their erasure of minority populations and harms done to them by dominant powers. However, these fabrications of historical record through centuries of selective archival practice results in a history that is not as stable as one would like to believe. The emergence of this scholarship illustrates the fact that history is a story, one that is actively being reshaped and reconfigured. Archival materials typically document the realities of real subjects. However, the vast discrepancy between the reality of history compared to how it is documented, memorialized, and remembers revealed that those remembered narratives can themselves be works of fiction. Both authors and theorists alike have explored the implications of what it would mean to consider historical record as fictional construction and the liberatory potential of this framework. Manipulations of historical record have largely been used in the past as a way to change the meaning of the past. These manipulations have worked to protect the origin story of America and therefore believe that they have a legitimate claim to land, citizenship, and identity. The origin story of America, which is largely fictionally constructed, has a direct impact on the way that white Americans conduct themselves in the present. Conversely, manipulations of the historical record can also grant minority subjects the ability to find themselves in archives and build new worlds within history, and therefore the present. In her now famous essay, Venus in Two Acts, Saidiya Hartman coins the term critical fabulation. Critical fabulation refers to a critical methodology that Hartman practices in her archival work. Hartman says, "But I want to say more than this. I want to do more than recount the violence that deposited these traces in the archive. I want to tell a story about two girls capable of retrieving what remains dormant, the purchase or claim of their lives on the present, without committing further violence in my own active narration. It is a story predicated upon impossibility, listening for the unsaid, translating misconstructed words, and refashioning disconfigured lives, and an attempt on achieving an impossible goal, redressing the violence that produced numbers, ciphers, and fragments of discourse, which is as close as we come to a biography of the captive and the enslaved." The intention here isn't anything as miraculous. Wait, this is still Hartman. The intention here isn't anything as miraculous as recovering the lives of enslaved or redeeming the dead, but rather laboring to paint as full a picture of the lives of captives as possible. This double gesture can be described as straining against the limits of the archive to write a cultural history of the captive, and at the same time enacting the impossibility of representing the lives of captives precisely through the process of narration. The method guiding this writing practice is best described as critical fabulation. Fabula denotes the basic elements of a story, the building blocks of the narrative. A fabula, according to Mickey Ball, is a series of logical and chronologically related events that are caused and experienced by actors. An event is a transition from one state to another. Actors are agents that perform actions. They are not necessarily human. To act is to cause or experiment and event. This paper argues that critical fabulation illuminates new possibilities for the narration of history and the material impact speculative fiction can have. Critical fabulation can be likened to a form of speculative fiction because of the way it is focused on building new worlds within the archive and imagining new possibilities within existing history. Traditional understanding of speculative fiction root the genre in its ability to envision futurity, but Hartman argues that by taking the time to imagine the past worlds of minoritarian subjects, we are able to create a new future. When I first started working with these ideas, I wanted to make the argument that critical fabulation was or could be a form of speculative fiction, but I no longer believe this to be true. Hartman is very clear that critical fabulation is not romantic. It is not a complete recovery of enslaved people in the archive, and this will never be possible. According to Hartman, critical fabulation will always fail. Instead, I want to think about critical fabulation as a way to provide more meaning and importance to what we think of as speculative fiction, its relationship to historical narration, and how the two in conjunction can have material impacts on present society and the future. I will spend the rest of this paper applying these ideas to Hartman's book, Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, Intimate Histories of Riotous Black Girls, Troublesome Women, and Queer Radicals. Sadai Hartman wrote Wayward Lives in 2019, about 10 years after she wrote Venus in Two Acts. This book is part novel and part historical study of Black women and girls who lived in American cities in the early 20th century. Hartman identifies Black women and girls in the archives of the city and uses narrative techniques to expand upon their lives and interior worlds. This practice combines historical study and fictionalized narrative in order to create new worlds within the archive. Hartman described her process for writing the book in a preface titled A Note on Method. All these characters and events found in this book are real. None are invented. What I know about the lives of these young women have been culled from journals of rent collectors, surveys and monographs of sociologists, trial transcript, slum photographs, reports of vice investigators, social workers, and parole officers, interviews with psychiatrists and psychologists, and prison case files, all of which represent them as a problem. I've crafted a counter-narrative liberated from the judgment and classification that subjected young Black women to surveillance, arrest, punishment, and confinement, and offer an account that attends to beautiful experience, to make living an art. Undertaken by those often described as promiscuous, reckless, wild, and wayward. Wayward Lives elaborates, arguments, transposes, and breaks open archival documents so they might yield a richer picture of the social upheaval that transformed Black social life in the 20th century. The goal is to understand and experience the world as these young women did, to learn from what they know. I prefer to think of this book as a fugitive text of the wayward, and is marked by the errantry that it describes. In this spirit, I have pressed the limits of the case file and the document, speculated about what might have been, imagined things whispered in dark bedrooms, and amplified moments of withholding, escape, and possibility, moments when the visions and dreams of the wayward seem possible. In this meditation of her own writing, Hartman describes her practice of finding Black women and girls in the historical record and creating counter-narratives to the way that their lives have been documented. This combination of historical study and fictional narration allows Hartman to create rich lives for the Black girls and women who have only been memorialized in the archives as problems. In stories, we are able to create visions of the future that we want to see. Hartman's imagination of the past through the eyes of those who have been violently erased by historical record allows the audience to understand history differently and potentially their own present differently. Hartman closes her essay, Venus in Two Acts, with failure. She remarks that she cannot save the enslaved women who've been lost in the archive, but she can use the understanding created by critical fabulation to imagine how their lives created the condition for her own. This is true for all historical narration. A deep understanding of the past inevitably creates a more clear understanding of the present. But what about a past that is fictionally invented? And moreover, what relationship can this have to fictionalized future societies? Stories of the past and the future both shape our present world and have the ability to alter how we conduct ourselves in the present moment. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Let's go back to that. Yeah. Let me go back to where are the bios? Cool. Last but not least, we have Wendy Walter. Wendy is a senior at Scripps College, one of the Claremont colleges, where she's majoring in history with a concentration in history of science and medicine and minoring in classics/ancient studies. This fall, she completed her senior thesis, Thanks a Million, Dr. Salk, Public Reception of Jonas Salk as a Cold War Scientist, which examined how the public imagined the inventor of the Salk polio vaccine as uniquely heroic in a landscape defined by anxieties around the scientist. She is currently considering future graduate work in the history of science, but is also open to exploring a work in archives and museums. This is her first presentation at a scholarly conference. Congrats!
Thank you. Oh, cool. Undergraduate. All right. I'm going to make some weird transitions, so you might have to get creative with it. Cool. We'll do. I was so honest. I don't know how to do it. Oh, that's how it works. That makes sense. Excellent. All right. Can you hear me? Excellent. All right. Well, first of all, happy First Contact Day. Bit of a change of pace there, but here we go. So, moving into it. Throughout the Star Trek franchise, libraries, archives, and museums of all kinds are depicted as crucial to the construction of historical memory. Episodes such as Star Trek Enterprise's Shockwave Part 2 see the heroes determining when the timeline was altered by using a library in a post-apocalyptic future. While in the original series episode, All Our Yesterdays, a library actually sends the heroes back in time. Museums have also frequently shown up, usually being portrayed as by and for Starfleet, depicting significant moments and objects from Federation and franchise history. After the release of the Discovery episode Labyrinths, which was filmed partly in the University of Toronto's Fisher Rare Book Library, the official Star Trek website published a brief introduction to numerous depictions of the archive in Star Trek. Left off the list was one notable omission, namely the Voyager episode Living Witness, which takes place at the Museum of Kyrian Heritage, otherwise known as the MKH. This absence is striking since, unlike the examples noted above or on the official list, Living Witness does not treat the archive simply as a setting or as a source of information, but instead critically interrogates the intersection of museums, historical knowledge, and political power. Living Witness opens with the warship Voyager allying with an alien species known as the Vaskins in their war against the neighboring Kyrians, an alliance the Vaskins quickly regret, as our hero Captain Janeway commits genocide against the Kyrians. This sequence is revealed to be a historical reconstruction, presented at the MKH more than 700 years after the, quote, Voyager incident. It is at this moment that an archaeological dig recovers an artifact left from that event. The Voyager's doctor, a hologram, who wakes up, having become a literal museum piece. Over the course of the episode, the Doctor acts as an embodied archive of historical knowledge, who reveals the omissions and gaps in the historical record, as well as the way in which the historical narrative centered by the MKH has been constructed within its own fundamentally political present. Institutionalized knowledge emerges as a key mechanism by which status quo is maintained, a status quo that is revealed to be untenable once the stability of historical knowledge is disrupted. Living Witness explores the social construction of history in the museum context. Yet, even as Living Witness examines and critiques the inherent politics of historical narratives and the political function of museums within the state, it ultimately upholds the idea that an ideal future can be reached if only museums centered real history, eliding other structural concerns. The problem at the beginning of the episode is a concern with the way in which museums, even ones that seek to elevate subaltern perspectives reproduce hegemonic structures of power. By the end, the episode seems to consider subaltern history and implicitly marginalized populations as problematic. Nevertheless, in its configuration of past, present, and future, Living Witness contains fascinating potential and remains unique among Star Trek episodes in its critical approach to the politics of museums and archives. To appreciate the institutionalization of history as it happens in the MKH, we may consider it as a memorial museum. In exhibiting atrocity, the politics of past violence, Amy Sidaro describes a memorial museum as serving three functions. First, provide a truthful account of history. Second, to serve as a site of healing and justice for victims of historical violence. And third, to morally educate visitors so as to ensure historical violence is never repeated. To that end, memorial museums center victim perspectives as a means of building empathy, particularly when the victims of the violence committed remain marginalized in the present moment. Yet, as Sidaro notes, quote, memorial museums are also political tools, often created and utilized with specific political agendas that can, and often do, compromise their declared efforts to openly confront and learn from the past. All of these descriptors apply to the MKH, which memorializes the genocide of the Kirian. As the Kirian curator of the MKH, Quarren, says, it took centuries for us to undo the damage that Captain Janeway had done, and the Kirian struggle for equality is far from over. This museum is a testament to that struggle. One place where the MKH diverges from Sidaro's model is its distance from the events it describes. While all the museums Sidaro evaluates memorialized moments in living memory, the MKH is 700 years out from the Voyager incident and subsequent war. This is significant because Sidaro argues that crucial to the way in which memorial museums function is the inclusion of first-hand accounts. While the MKH historical simulations are significantly featured, the absence of personal accounts due to the distance from the events diminishes the museum's efficacy and renders its exhibits, in the words of its guests, merely fossils, inspiring Quarren's feeling that he can only prove the truth of his museum if he can exhibit Voyager's version of these events in their own words. With the discovery of the Doctor, Quarren acquires personal testimony, but puts at risk his accepted narrative of the Voyager encounter. The moment the museum memorializes becomes living memory, and the historical, political, and social dynamics which structure the memorial museum are thrown into chaos. Prior to the events of Living Witness, the history of violence in Vascan society was largely settled and institutionalized in a museum attended by Vaskans and Kirians alike. What's more, while Quarren and the Kirian Arbiter both associate the MKH with the present struggle for Kirian equality, the emphasis is consistently placed on the significance of the past Voyager incident. This recalls Sidaro's claim that, quote, implicit in the creation of memorial museums, then, is that the past is truly past, and that, quote, the message is the same. This negative and violent past is behind us, and that healing can begin, since the evils of the past have been locked up in display cases. The emphasis on the ongoing struggle for Kirian equality is undermined by the very structure of the Memorial Museum, which is contingent upon the past being past. This idea is explicitly invoked within the episode by the Vascan Arbiter's response to the Kirian charge that the Doctor's Voyager narrative doesn't change how present Kirian marginalization is historically rooted. The Vascan dismisses this, saying, quote, today's problems are not at issue here. This is about history. Regarding the Memorial Museum's healing function, any reconciliation requires agreement that the underlying problem has passed. Thus, when the institutionalized past is made present with the discovery of the Doctor, the foundations upon which the Memorial Museum is built are destabilized. The nature of this destabilization suggests that the MKH could never have successfully supported reconciliation, and that it is no coincidence that not only did the museum fail to heal, it became a site of rupture. As Quarren reassures the Doctor after the tensions between Vaskans and Kirians erupt, You were only the catalyst. The pressure's been building for years. It was only a matter of time before something set it off. The doctor's presence and his disruption of the institutionalized historical narrative activate a violence that has been building for years, suggesting that the MKH succeeded only in obscuring the potential for violence rather than diffusing it. Both the Baskins and the Curians come to consider the MKH a failure once the doctor's testimony is introduced. Referring back to Sodaro, the Baskins consider the MKH to have failed in its truth-telling function, while the Curians consider the museum to have failed in its memorial function. While the Baskins are concerned with the way in which narratives emphasizing Curian struggle undermine present power structures over which they preside, they phrase these concerns by calling into question the, quote, truth of the museum. The Curians, by contrast, view the MKH as failing its memorial role, most notably in the function of museums as forms of symbolic reparation that can be used in situations where more robust transitional justice measures are not possible. While the memorial function of the MKH promoted reconciliation primarily through criticism of the status quo, the discovery of the doctor means that, quote, more robust transitional justice measures are now possible, i.e., through the trial and presumed execution of the doctor as a war criminal. In spite of these failures as a memorial museum, the MKH ultimately succeeds in promoting change, as a flash forward reveals that it was the site where the first steps towards meaningful reconciliation occurred. However, the way that this is achieved within the context of the episode is through Quarren's decision to fix history, but only by addressing the Vaskin concern about truth. In the process, the burden of confronting the past is disproportionately assigned to the Curians, for it is their history, as represented in the MKH, that is discovered to be false. This reflects Stuart Hall's analysis of unconscious racism as, quote, predicated on the unstated and unrecognized assumption that the blacks are the source of the problem. After all, while the Baskins are implied to have their own narratives of the Voyager incident and the Great War, Quarren's reconciliation focuses only on correcting the Curian record. The Baskins and the Curians are, in the logic of the episode, made equal in the future by being made equally culpable in the past present. In this configuration, while the Baskins, according to Quarren, proceeded to occupy our lands, forcing our people into subservience, creating the asymmetric racial power structure that continues to subjugate Curians in the present, the problem of racial reconciliation is still a Curian responsibility. The emphasis on correcting Curian history as the key step to, seemingly, solving racism undermines the core strengths of the episode, most notably its critical engagement with the relationship between state, institutions, and the production of historical knowledge. Yet, the final revelation that the entire episode is no more than another historical recreation contained in a future iteration of the museum contains its own radical potential. While this moment may be read as imagining an ideal future achieved through the same non-specific dialogue and harmony as so many of Star Trek's utopian social visions, it cannot be taken at face value. After all, the simulation featured in Quarren's museum was a flawed reconstruction of the past. So, why should the events that made up the body of the episode and are represented in this future version of the MKH be considered with a less critical eye? What would this mean in terms of analyzing all that came before? While the episode does not confront these questions directly, the potential they contain cannot be ignored. While many iterations of Star Trek take libraries, museums, and other archival spaces as their settings, Living Witness is unique for its critical focus on questions including the function of museums and other spaces of institutionalized knowledge in the maintenance of oppression, the political utility of memorialization and historical knowledge construction, and the purpose of archival spaces in imagining both past and future. The conclusions that Living Witness reaches are incomplete and problematic, but nonetheless reflect a more radical interest in how history shapes and is shaped by societal anxieties and aspirations. Though Living Witness aired in 1998, it has taken on a new timeliness even within the past month, as, I'm sure we're all aware, the sitting president has targeted U.S. libraries and signed an executive order to, quote, restore truth and sanity to American history by rewriting how the Smithsonian Institution is allowed to exhibit the past, with an eye towards erasing the historical experiences of marginalized identities altogether. The archival space is not and never has been simply a setting or repository of information, but a profoundly political space which can serve to either uphold or disrupt the status quo. For much of the episode, the MKH is depicted as upholding the status quo. Yet, it is revealed in the final moments of the episode to have the potential to generate legitimate reconciliation between the Curians and the Vaskins. Even as Living Witness portrays the Memorial Museum as a flawed institution, it never rejects the transformative potential of historical narratives entirely. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. Let's give another round of applause for our panelists today. I believe we have a mic floating around for Q&A. Anyone know where that went? Is this one? Oh, okay. Wonderful. We have time for one or two questions. I can't take this out. Just kidding, I can. Who has a question? Any takers? I'm going to start. Yeah, thank you. Don't let me bring out my teacher sona.
Fantastic presentations, everybody. And, happy First Contact Day. And I was interested in the way that all three of your presentations were very interested in historical veracity from non-standard sources. That is to say, yes, reimagining archives, but also reimagining what is considered an official source versus what is not. As you pointed out, Wendy, that often the official sources are extraordinarily politicized and are sanitized, you might say, for consumption that doesn't cause rupture. And so I wonder, just anyone who would like to speak to that, what it is about history that might be uncontainable, or what it is that makes history official or not, with the premise, of course, that history is always more complex than history textbooks make it seem like.
We'll do some more. All right. So starting from that question, one thing I think is very interesting in the episode that I don't really talk about is that there is this trial of the Doctor's historical narrative, in which this new revision of history is cross-examined and rejected by different parties, considered unofficial, but official enough to be politically disruptive. I think that's a very interesting theme to imagine, like how is the official narrative constructed, especially because he is an unconventional official source. He views his own history that he's presenting, not as a political history, but as a personal history. It was something that happened to him yesterday from his perspective. And his main concern with the veracity is because it misrepresents his colleagues and friends as these villainous figures. It is only later that he comes to consider himself as an official historical source in a political sense, in a political context. So there's an interesting dialogue that sort of functions in the undercurrent of this episode in this notion of veracity and what is considered officially acceptable. And I think the episode comes to an interesting conclusion, which is that when he comes to recognize himself as a political history, as a political archive, he asks to be killed. So as to not compromise the narrative that he knows to be true, the historical facts that he represents, but not to cause further political disruption, not to recant what he says, but to be rendered unofficial, illegitimate, and gone off the face of the earth. And so while I do have my problems with the conclusion, the curator who I've been describing here does argue that this life is essential. Life must be recognized as legitimate. And that in recognizing this life as legitimate, you recognize this history as legitimate. And that is the sort of final moment before this conclusion. So I'm not quite sure what to make of it, but that's kind of where I was going with it. If anyone else wants to speak to these points.
It's a complex question because I think asking like whose history is right is essentially asking whose truth is right, which is it's a tricky answer because there isn't really an answer, except for the fact that I think it's incredibly culture bound. I think some cultures rely on written archives and like art archives even. Some cultures are oral, some cultures are dance-based. I think some cultures are incredibly spiritual as well. And so I can't say what history is true because I have to answer from a cultural perspective. And mine is that culture is a feeling that is passed between members of family. So, and in my mind, that's what history equates to being. So if I don't have perspectives in my archive of my life, my ancestors' lives as enslaved people or as indigenous people, then I'm going to know my history as something that was passed down, or even more than that, epigenetically, a feeling of like feeling fear or feeling comfort, even in certain places. So in that way, I think history is tricky. I think ideally, that's what history would be. But I think in reality, history is what we all agree to allow to be history. So I think as scholars, it's our responsibility to respect cultural history as it comes to us and figure out how it can piece together in ways that are respectful of people. There's going to be debate. There's going to be argument. Histories will step into people's toes. And I think it's important to keep in mind past placement of power in respect to current power systems, to parse our history. And I think even history doesn't need to be agreed upon even. I don't need a white person to agree with me that my history is right or wrong. I don't need it. We can talk about it. It can be fun to compare and discuss, but I think it's important that history isn't completely factual or isn't completely agreed upon. I think history just has to be what you feel, and that's hard and it sucks, but it's kind of what's true, I think. And I know there's a classicist, her historian's going to stab me in the face later, and I understand, but that's my perspective. And I do think, on your note, I think it's wonderful that all three of us had very similar pieces. I love that you talked about, Dr. That was amazing. I was excited. I love that you talked about Star Trek and like the idea of living memorial. I think that's in all of our pieces even. So I think this panel selection was amazing, and I love that we were all here together. So I'm super excited to hear your answer to this question.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the fact that all three of us talked about historical narration and historical memorization like speaks to the fact that like it feels like so much history is like under attack right now, and it feels like the way that we conceptualize history is so important to the way that like we conduct ourselves like in the present. And I think that like what you're talking about, like history is a feeling, history is personal. I think that like the issue is that like so much of what like America has considered history in the past is entirely based on like Enlightenment philosophies around like rationality and reason. And I think like that really impacts what materials, like, because I think that like a lot of our history is like, at least in America, a lot of our history is based on these like documents, like these like material objects that are placed in like libraries and museums. And I think that like the construction that like only those items are like real history is like deeply harmful to how history is narrated. Like I think about, like you're saying, like history that's like performed, history that's like orally transmitted. I think about I'm not sure if you're familiar with Diana Taylor and like her the archive versus the repertoire, but like her idea that like there's like the archive, which is composed of like material items, and then like the repertoire is this like sort of embodied history that's like passed down. And so yeah, I think like this idea about like what history is like official is like individual, but then it's also like highly personal and like based like in family. And I think about like the second or third wave feminist idea that like the personal is political. I think like the personal is history.
Awesome. Anyone else? I see some thinking faces. We have time for one more question. Is there any in the Zoom chat? No? Okay. Well, I have a question. It's kind of similar to Baker's, but given how your projects all intersect in the form of like memory and history, and for Chauncey and here specifically, Sadia Hartman, how do you feel like your projects like speak to each other? Like you were talking a little bit earlier about how it's similar, but how would you feel like your project kind of responds to each other? How do you feel like you can develop your projects further, like having heard from each other?
I honestly think that like Shanti's project like is like the example of like what I was arguing about how like historical fiction like is kind of like speculative fiction, and how like this like creation of like new stories like within the archive is like what creates like different like has the ability to create like dismantle like our existing like systems that like aren't working for people. And so yeah, I would love the opportunity to read your creative inquiry if you feel like sharing.
I have to say the same about Kara's work. I really enjoyed how you interpreted the fabulation work that like Saida Hartman often does. And I think that your conclusion at the end of having to decide that it has to be separate and it has to also like interweave at the same time as a different string is incredibly valuable. And I also love your work as well, Wendy. I think analyzing that specific episode was so important. I'm a Star Trek fan to the win. But I think it's incredibly valuable to look at that specific episode as an idea of living memorial, because I think that's what Saida Hartman's entire work is all about. It's the idea of sharing stories to as much as you can, and then filling in the gaps with what you feel. And I think that's kind of what your piece was about. And tell me if I'm wrong, but I loved it and I wanted to hear more. It reminds me a lot of the African American History Museum that's in Washington, D.C. They have a booth in the back where people that have experienced enslavement or sharecropping or even Jim Crow laws and anything after that, even the war on drugs, can share stories in that booth. And there are stories from enslaved people that are in that, like that memorials catalog. And that is a primary source. And in a way, it's a living memorial like you're speaking to. And I think it's like wonderful that there's that interplay between science fiction and reality that both of you are hitting on. And it's such a great panel. So I want to hear more from you, Wendy.
All right. So I really think we intersected in some fascinating ways. I had not thought of Hartman, but I read her previously, and seeing you guys talk about her really allowed me to better conceptualize how my work was intersecting with her, because it is this idea of like, what would happen if this critical fabulation could emerge from the archive and speak to you. Again, this is 700 years after the fact. And I think there's actually, and this is another connection between you and I, a sort of classical mode of understanding this, like how you would do this as a classicist, which is that 700 years after the fact, Parham, the curator, is looking at these different artifacts as a way of trying to gather this history and trying to understand and bring forth these voices of his Kyrian ancestors who had been fighting even back then. And he finds this other figure who he'd been similarly interested. But being in like, this notion of classical museum work, so much of classical museum work has been influenced. What we know of the classical world has been shaped by what 18th century and 19th century writers were saying and projecting onto those time periods and onto those artifacts and onto the people that they read about. And it's only more recently that scholars have been looking at trying to disentangle this, to look back at these original pieces, look back at these original words, at these original people, and trying to rediscover them in new ways, not rejecting that we exist in our own present and we are looking at them from our present, but trying to like bring forth these new elements that have been submerged by the fact that many of these classicists in the 19th and 20th centuries were white and imperial and operating in these colonial spheres. And I think that idea is coming forth in yours with Steno and this notion of Medusa and how Medusa has been portrayed historically is really fascinating when brought into the idea that her connection to Blackness. I'm sorry, I got sort of sidetracked there, but it's fascinating work how I was not expecting to have another presenter interested in classics for this one. So I'm very happy to see you. And I would love to do more work with seeing how Hartman intersects here.
I want to add really quickly, because you mentioned it, there is an interesting interplay between like Sita Hartman, Afrofuturism, and classicism, I think, that needs to be studied going forward. The fact that this woman was named Venus in the first place speaks to a racism built into classicism that allowed this enslaved woman to be called that in the first place. My looking into Medusa and the fact that she was Black and it's been kind of erased and scrubbed is intriguing as well. And then you as a classicist can kind of see how classicism has been used to support like the repression of Black people and other minority people. And I think the antebellum South was built on this idea of white superiority that existed during classic period. And I think it's a mutual struggle to not look back at classism and try to prove that you belong there, while also using it to dismantle what has been told about people in the recent future. So Afro-classism is doing interesting work in that field, and I think that researchers like you guys are going to be doing interesting work. But I do want to keep an eye on classics interplaying with Afrofuturism, because I think it can create some really interesting opportunities and really dangerous pitfalls. So I'm so excited.
Up, everyone.